Hello, and welcome to this installment of the Future Grind podcast. I'm your host, Ryan O'Shea, and today I'll be speaking with Todd Kuiken. Todd is a senior research scholar at the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University, where he is focused on studying biosafety and biosecurity within the do-it-yourself biology community. In this role, Todd travels the world to visit various community labs with the ultimate goal of making citizen science safer and more accessible. Todd previously spent time in Washington, D.C., leading both the Wilson Center's Synthetic Biology project and their project on Emerging Nanotechnologies. We discuss his collaboration with DIYbio.org, safety within citizen science, the handling of public perception, what is holding DIYbio back, and more. As always, show notes and links are available at futuregrind.org. We're on iTunes, Stitcher, and wherever podcasts are found. A video version of this episode is posted on Facebook and YouTube. Make sure to subscribe on all of these platforms, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. If you'd like to keep this podcast running, you can donate at futuregrind.org/support. Because of you, this is Future Grind. All right, and now we are here with Todd. Todd, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, happy to be here.
So I think it might be best to start this off with a little introduction. So who are you and what do you do?
Sure. So I work at North Carolina State University in their Genetic Engineering and Society Center. And I look at lots of different topics around governance of emerging technologies, particularly synthetic biology and the latest genomic technologies. And as part of that work, I've been working with the do-it-yourself biology community for the last 8 or 9 years or so.
And what is DIYbio?
It's many things. But I would say it's a collection of citizens and everyday individuals that are interested in science, particularly biology and biotechnology, that have formed a community that are now having access to the different tools, information, and techniques of biology and biotechnology. And they've formed a collection of community biotechnology laboratories that have now spread across the globe.
So essentially, this is education and research that used to exist in corporate labs or academic labs that has now moved into the community sphere and is being done by citizens. Is that right?
Yeah, you could probably equate it to the maker community in a way, except the tools that this maker community uses is biology.
And I think there's one other term that we should define before we get into things here, and it's one you already mentioned, and that is synthetic biology. I've heard this used quite a few different ways, but what does it mean to you?
What it means to me is a very interesting question, and one that we grapple with for a number of years in many different international reports. For me, I would say synthetic biology is really just the next set of tools of genetic engineering and biotechnology, but with a focus more, I would say, from the engineering discipline or the design of biological systems.
And were you involved at all in the creation of the DIYbio nonprofit organization that Jason Bobe and Mackenzie Cowell founded in 2008?
So no, I was not. Both Jason and Mackenzie formed that group, and it's really, I would say, an organization and website and place for the community to kind of convene, and was really in the beginning the place where most of the community was actually communicating with one another about their different meetup groups. So it was kind of just a portal of information in terms of different groups that existed, where they were. They would kind of introduce themselves on the website. And over the years, it's kind of grown to provide additional information and different resources specifically for the DIYbio community and community laboratories.
So that would be the start of some kind of structure around this community, but where do you trace the beginnings of the DIYbio community to?
That's a good question. I'm not sure you can trace it to any one particular event or person. You could say that in the US, you could trace it back to the first meeting of people at the Blackguard, which was a pub in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where a bunch of individuals kind of got together and started talking about biology and providing access to biology and people sort of interested in doing biological experiments outside of your traditional spaces. And so, from there, Jason and Mackenzie started DIYbio.org, which, is a historical marker, I guess you could say, in terms of having a website. But people have been doing citizen science and individual exploration and scientific experiments forever. I think it's just gained more attention because maybe there's a term around it now, of DIYbio.
So, what is your background and how did you get interested in and involved with this field?
Sure. So I'm an environmental scientist. I used to research the biogeochemical cycling of mercury in the environment. So in essence, I was a field scientist. When I left the field, I moved to Washington D.C. because I'm always been interested in environmental policy. And I felt that I could have a bigger impact in environmental policy, in essence, in a governance sort of framework, as opposed to doing direct scientific research and then writing a paper. And then, maybe some people read the paper, but then nothing really ever comes of it. And so I wanted to actually be able to take that kind of scientific knowledge and translate that into hopefully effective environmental policies. So when I went to DC about, it was 10 years ago, I guess at this point, I got a position at the Woodrow Wilson Center, which is an independent think tank. And we were working on nanotechnology, and then we developed a synthetic biology program. And in the beginnings of that program, I found myself at a meeting out at UCLA called Outlaw Biology, where there was a panel of folks talking about this sort of new movement of do-it-yourself biologists. And that's where I met Jason Bobe. And I was just completely fascinated by this notion that, in essence, citizen scientists could utilize the tools and techniques of biology and modern biotechnology in a way that was producing, significant results, experiments, and just expanding the access to those tools and to that science. Because you just didn't see that in the nano space. The barriers to entry for nano are too high to sort of enable that kind of democratization of a science. And so that was really fascinating to me. And so I went back and I talked about it with some other folks at the Wilson Center. And, we thought that there might be a way for us to help enable the community while at the same time trying to address some of the governance questions, some of the, safety questions, and some of the security questions that were sort of floating around out there. And so that's how I initially became involved.
You mentioned your work with the Wilson Center Synthetic Biology Project there, but what is the Wilson Center and what is their interest in synthetic biology?
Sure. So the Wilson Center is part of the Smithsonian. It was set up as a living memorial to President Wilson, who was the only president that had a PhD. And one of the things that he's known for is bringing scholarship into the policymaking process. And so instead of erecting just a monument to him, they enacted this living memorial or this think tank. And as part of that, at the time, there was a science and technology innovation program inside the Wilson Center. And we had a grant from the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation to look at synthetic biology. And that from there grew our work with the do-it-yourself biology community.
And you are now a senior research scholar in the Genetic Engineering and Society Center at North Carolina State University. What's the focus of your work there, and what can we expect to come from that?
Sure. It's in essence, I'm doing the same type of work I was doing at the Wilson Center. The GES Center was started with the idea that interdisciplinary scholarship around a technology like genetic engineering is really critical. And so you can't just have the scientific exploration and discovery. You also have to include the societal impacts of that science and that technology. So our center brings together professors, graduate students, and other scholars from across campus. So including the social scientists, economists, STS scholars, philosophers, communication specialists, and then obviously those directly developing the technologies around, say, gene drives or genetic pest management. We also have a lot of work that's done in the agricultural space. And so we try to take a holistic perspective around a technology and examine what the impact to society would be on that, including obviously the governance and regulatory questions.
When we talk about governance and regulatory questions, a lot of that has to do directly with the DIYbio space, and there's a lot of questions still out to be decided around how this area should be regulated and governed. And I think one of the most noteworthy aspects of the DIYbio organization is their publication of the codes of ethics. And these codes are fairly general, with things such as adopt safe practices, biotechnology must only be used for peaceful purposes, and respect the environment. But as far as I'm aware, there's really no enforcement structure in place, and while certain community labs might have their own rules and authority, that hardly provides oversight for the community as a whole. So in your mind, what role do they play?
So I think they're very important and very effective. So that was one of the first things that Jason Bob and I did in our partnership right after we first met, actually. And so I think that the history of those codes is important to also remember. So when we held those two coding workshops, the first one we held in Europe, it was actually the first time that all of those various different DIYbio groups in Europe had ever actually met face to face. Up until then, they had mostly been just, talking with amongst one another on meetup groups or through the website. And also at the time, there was only a handful of actual labs in existence. I would say probably less than 5 would be my guess. And so what we thought was important and what we were really excited about seeing the results of those two workshops was that the community really came together before really anyone was sort of asking them to do this and talked about what they thought their hopes were, what their fears were, but most importantly, what their responsibility was to the technology and to the communities in which they live and work in. And I think that's reflected in how those codes of conduct came about. And, the other interesting thing to note is that we repeated the exercise then in the US with the US groups, and we did not share with them the results of the European groups because we wanted to see, in essence, if there would be differences. And while there's a few slight differences, what I think is great about those codes of conduct is that they're pretty similar between the US groups and the European groups. And, I think, over the last, about 8 years now, I guess, those codes I think have stood up. And I think the important part of those was that it was a way for the community to, in essence, introduce themselves to the larger society and said, hey, look, we understand that there may be some uncomfortableness with what we're doing, but here's our values, and these are the values that we want everyone to see, and the values that we've decided collectively, at least at the time, that we're going to follow.
Just curious, is there a certain reason why the North American and European codes are still separate documents and haven't been merged into a unified code of ethics?
Yeah, so they were never designed to be adopted word for word, universally. They were done initially just to see how the community was feeling at the time, and almost to serve as sort of as a template in a sense for, as more and more labs came online, for them to be able to look at these codes of conduct and then, develop their own for their own particular space. And so they're meant to be flexible. They're meant to be adapted. They were never meant to be this like universal. Everyone has agreed on every single one of these points.
One interesting resource provided through DIYbio.org is the Ask a Biosafety Expert tool, in which questions from DIY biologists can be submitted to a committee of volunteer biosafety experts. How were these biosafety experts identified, and do you know the process of getting that set up and how that was organized?
Yeah, so that was another project we did and developed at the Wilson Center with the help of Jason Bobe and the members of the DIY community. And it was really quite simple. The community, in essence, was operating safely, in my opinion, but they were asking, in essence, for help. Obvious sort of questions about, can we pour certain things down the drain? How do we deal with waste that might be generated in our labs? How do I set up a particular experiment? And what we quickly sort of realized was that, if you're at a university, you have access to a biosafety officer, in theory, right? That you could call up and ask those types of questions. Or you had been directly trained by the biosafety officer or someone in their office as, say, an entering student if in a laboratory. And so we kind of just sort of, asked a very kind of dumb question in our own mind, which is like, well, why can't we just provide this same kind of resource for the community? And I had been in discussions with ABSA, which is the American Biological Safety Association, which is basically the professional organization of biosafety officers internationally. And, kind of just started asking questions about, how can we provide this type of information for this? At the time, there was only a handful of labs, but how do we provide access to those types of biosafety officers? And to their credit, through the listserv of ABSA, we just put the question out there and said, hey, we're thinking about, developing a web portal. Would anyone be interested in serving as, in essence, the experts behind that web portal? And we got lots of individuals that thought that the idea of sort of citizen science is a good idea. It's good for society, and we're willing to donate their time to answer those questions that come through the web portal.
I watched the video titled Myths and Realities of the DIYbio Movement that the Woodrow Wilson Center published. And in that, there was some talk of the need for liability insurance to cover the advice that was given by those biosafety experts. Was this a considerable roadblock or complication into getting something like this off the ground?
Yes and no. Not from a financial standpoint, because we had a grant that was going to cover that. It was more of a roadblock because it was difficult to find an insurance company that would write a policy for what we were trying to do. It didn't really fit into any of their sort of typical traditional insurance liability boxes or forms. And so it took us a little while to actually find an insurance company that would write a policy specifically for that program.
Speaking of grants for this type of work, in September of 2017, the Open Philanthropy Project announced that they were awarding over $700,000 to support biosafety and biosecurity practices for the DIYbio community. This money was split between GenSpace and your work at NC State. So let's talk about this for a while. First of all, this sounds like a lot of money. How is that being spent, and what is the product or deliverable that will result from this work?
Sure. So there's two modules for this project. The first one is for Dan Grushkin and I to, in essence, update that 7 Myths and Realities report. And when we did that first report, 5 years ago, the community was relatively small. And so it was relatively easy for us to send a survey out and have members of the community sort of fill that out so we could get a sense of kind of, where people were working, what kind of experiments they were working on, what were their biosafety procedures and policies and the like. And what we wanted to do this time was to actually visit the spaces so we could actually sit down with the founders and the members of these labs and really hear the story of each individual lab, how they came about, what kind of programs they offering for their community, what kind of experiments they're doing, what are their biosafety practices and procedures. And then most importantly for this particular project, to ask them directly what, if anything, that they actually need help with in terms of biosafety and potentially biosecurity related issues. And so a big portion of the money of that is enabling Dan and I to actually travel across the globe and actually visit these labs that are now spread across globally. So there's, around about 100 of these labs that exist. We're not going to be visiting every single one of them, but we're in essence going to be visiting a good majority of them in each region of the world where they exist. The second piece of the program, which is actually the larger chunk of the money, is the Biosafety Fellowship Program. And so we're going to be hiring a handful of biosafety professionals or biosafety officers / lab managers to embed inside some community labs for a full year. We already have one of those. Her name is Angela Armendariz. She comes from the Exploratorium in San Francisco, and she is now embedded inside GenSpace. She's been there since about the end of July, early August. And the idea of that program is for them to actually become part of the community, look at what the biosafety practices and procedures are, and then develop, in essence, more robust procedures and practices. And then at the end of that year, they'll be developing an actual biosafety manual, in a sense. We're not exactly sure what the form of it will be, whether it's like a hard-bound book or an online resource. But in essence, it will be biosafety resources that are specifically designed for community laboratories, which can have some unique circumstances. And so it's not as always that simple to just sort of take a biosafety procedure from a university handbook and then sort of implement that in a community lab. The other part of that is what we're going to be piloting probably late spring of next year is a biosafety boot camp program. So this will be modeled off of one of ABSA's Biosafety 101 week-long programs that they offer to newly minted biosafety officers. And this will be a way to actually train members of community labs around biosafety and how to actually develop biosafety, training programs and procedures that they can bring back to their labs and implement there. With the idea hopefully being that type of course and program can be offered at least once a year moving forward.
So who or what is the Open Philanthropy... I can't say that word today. So who or what is the Open Philanthropy Project, and how did you get connected with them, and what's their interest in this space in general?
So the Open Philanthropy Project is it's not a new foundation, but it's a relatively new foundation. It's based out in Silicon Valley. And one of the areas that they are interested in is global catastrophic risk. And so they're interested in sort of looking at emerging technologies and trying to identify what the security implications would be of these technologies. I became involved with them, or first introduced to them, a number of years ago when they were hiring a new program officer for this new program they were going to be starting. And that was how I first got introduced to them. And then a few years later, once they finally hired that individual, I ran into her. Her name was Jamie Youssef. She's no longer there. I ran into her at an iGEM meeting, and we started talking about do-it-yourself biology and this project that Dan and I had an idea for. And so we started talking about how good we thought the community is, what they've been providing for the communities where the labs are, but that we thought there was, it was time to sort of take another look at where the community had grown to, and then also to try to figure out what some of the resources were that the community was asking for and needed in relation to sort of biosafety and biosecurity issues.
In a 2012 paper that you wrote for the Institute on Science for Global Policy, you said that the DIYbio community could spur innovation and create technological breakthroughs, but that would require, quote, responsible oversight. Why do you think responsible oversight is necessary, and what form could that take?
Yeah, so I consider responsible oversight in a way what the community is already doing. So I think too often when we use the terms regulations or particularly governance, we automatically assume that that means some sort of government agency that's going to sort of be implementing some rules with a threat of being able to shut you down. What the DIY community, I think, has shown over the years is that if you talk about these issues from the very beginning, that in essence, the regulated entity, in a sense, right, can actually put a lot of their own programs in place that deals with a lot of the issues that people are concerned about. And I think the community has done that quite well so far. And to the point where I don't necessarily think that there needs to be any specific regulation for just community laboratories. There are lots of different rules and regulations around doing this type of research that the DIY community has to follow and does follow. So one example of that is in Europe, you have to have a license to do any kind of genetic engineering. And so the community laboratories that are operating in Europe applied for those licenses and have received those licenses. And so there doesn't seem to be at this point, at least in my opinion, any specific regulation that has to be implemented that's just geared towards community laboratories.
Yeah, licensing has been a very controversial subject in DIYbio, with George Church from Harvard University quoted in the New York Times as saying, anyone who does synthetic biology should be under surveillance, and anyone who does it without a license should be suspect. Others feel that it's an example of unnecessary red tape. What are your thoughts on licensing?
Well, I think it depends. And so, one of the things that we've been asking the community about is not necessarily about a license, but more of about you can almost think of it as like a certification potentially, right? But that's in essence certifying the space, right? The laboratory itself. One of the things that, the questions we've been asking is, what would that look like if a space had to, say, be certified around, safety or around security, for instance? And, what I think we've already been finding is that most of these spaces already have a certification already sort of happening in terms of the building code, for instance, or the fire department has come in and inspected the space for fire safety. There's been other spaces where the county health department has come in and in essence inspected them because they're dealing with biological waste, not human waste like blood or anything, but just because they're doing biology, the health department has come in and taken a look and in essence given them sort of a certification, so to speak. I think when you talk about licenses, the question that I always come back to is, well, who would give this license out, right? Is it a license like you get? Is it like a fishing license? Is it like a cosmetology license where an individual state is giving these out? And if it's a license, does that then also mean, that, say, a university professor has to get a license to do this kind of work? Would a graduate student have to get a license to do this kind of work? So I think those are questions that are bigger than just DIYbio and community labs. But like I said, like in Europe, those licenses already exist and the community has gotten them. So it hasn't necessarily been a barrier to entry, at least for those labs in Europe that have attained those licenses.
Do you happen to know what the process is for licensing in Europe?
It's, from what I understand, it's basically by country, and it's like a facility license in a sense, right? So they're in essence certifying your facility that you're mostly around containment, right? So they're sort of basically checking to make sure that anything that you're working on or developing inside your lab isn't going to sort of escape and then, destroy the entire planet.
Yeah, I think we definitely want to avoid planetary destruction if possible. And on that note, you have been in talks with the National Security Agency and the United Nations Bioweapons Convention, among others. If you could generalize a bit, what are the concerns that these organizations have when it comes to DIYbio and synthetic biology?
I think in relation to DIYbio, it's been mostly at least the way that I approach those types of interactions is to just introduce them to what's actually happening. I think a lot of times, folks that are deeply embedded in the security world who are sort of hardwired to worry about everything, right? When they hear do-it-yourself biology or they hear about community laboratories working on genetic engineering or synthetic biology, they sort of automatically go towards the doomsday scenarios. And so a lot of the work that, not just me, but the community it's in general have done when we have these conversations and people go and give talks to these groups is to just introduce them and tell them exactly what they've been doing. And again, that gets back to a bit about like the codes of conduct was to be completely transparent and to put out there what the community's values are, what the community has been working on. It's all open. There's nothing secretive going on. And so some of it is just a misunderstanding of what these community labs are, what they do, and who they're serving. And for the most part, once, you've made those introductions, most of those security concerns tend to go away.
Certain media outlets may have blown the concerns around biosafety and biosecurity within the DIYbio community out of proportion, but that doesn't mean that there aren't valid concerns that do exist, and that these conversations shouldn't be had. So, a little two-part question for you. First, what are the overblown concerns that don't hold much weight? And second, what are the actual concerns that we should be talking about?
I think the overblown concerns are the notion that someone in a community lab is going to design, develop, and release some killer virus that's going to destroy the world or kill lots of people. That has tended to be the sort of overblown headline that we've seen. And it's so far from reality in terms of capabilities of the labs, but also intent of the labs. And what we are constantly trying to battle with, particularly in the press, is that question about intent. You have to have intent in order to do something that terrible and that illegal. And so we have to separate that particular concern versus, I think legitimate biosafety concerns that exist in any laboratory. And that's what I think the community has been extremely well in doing, is trying to be proactive of trying to identify what those issues are and what types of procedures and resources need to be implemented in order to deal with those. And, that's in essence what this project that Dan Grushkin and I have is to try to sort of anticipate what some of those issues might be in the next few years, 5 years from now, as the number of labs have expanded and also the sophistication of the labs have increased.
In your travels to these various lab spaces, have there been any particular projects or ways of doing work that weren't exactly safe that concerned you the most that people should be aware of to make sure that they don't do themselves?
No, to be honest. And to be honest with you, we weren't anticipating seeing anything like that. Like I said, I've been involved with this community for a long time now. And I argue, and I believe this, that I believe the DIY community acts more responsibly and actually is probably more overly cautious than what you would find in a typical university laboratory.
So, biosafety and biosecurity are very important topics, but they seem to be entirely separate from another issue, which is ethics. Do bioethics play a role in any of your work, or is that beyond the scope of your focus?
It's not directly part of this project, and I do think that is something that the community needs to, I think, pay more attention to. But I think it's been a more recent issue that's arisen over the last few years. I had another project with a colleague, Eleanor Powells, at the Woodrow Wilson Center that was funded by the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, where we were looking at the citizen health space, right? So people that were either, attempting to develop therapies or to develop medical devices, typically around very rare diseases, where there either wasn't a lot of research going on, or where the cost to sort of enter into, a study or even to get those therapies was prohibitive. And I think when you start to introduce that type of research, the ethical questions become critically important. And I think it's something that the community is going to have to start thinking about more in-depthly. And that's going to require, I think, some additional resources, not necessarily in terms of money, but just reaching out to, say, the ethics community to sort of bring them in terms of asking different types of questions, which are very different than just a straight biosafety question about a project.
How can participants in the DIYbio and synthetic biology communities stay on the good side of both government agencies and public opinion? What messaging should be used or steps should be taken to lower fear and increase acceptability?
I think they need to continue to do what they've been doing, which is to be completely transparent and open. I think there's no better way to explain a technology or a science or reduce a fear about a science or a technology than for people to actually see it and to feel it and to experience it. And that, I think, is one of the greatest benefits of these types of community labs, is that it's providing a window into a science that up until these labs existed was really foreign to most people. It would just seemed out of reach or out of touch, or they had just never even heard of it. So I think just the mere fact that these spaces exist and they're providing these opportunities for people to learn about the science and the technology itself helps to reduce those fears and concerns.
So in 2016, you wrote a piece for the journal Nature, and you mentioned Josiah Zayner. Josiah has a PhD in molecular biophysics from the University of Chicago and has done work in synthetic biology for NASA. But Josiah now runs the Odin, a company that sells genetic engineering kits that enable customers to genetically modify plants, animals, and themselves. This has been quite controversial and has even been lampooned on Last Week Tonight with John Oliver. What are your thoughts on companies like the Odin, and how would you suggest that the DIYbio community engage with people like Josiah?
So I think it's what's the word I'm looking for? I think it's good and bad all at the same time. So I think some of the kits that the Odin produces, I think, are great in terms of providing people access to the tools that they need for biology, genetic engineering, and synthetic biology. However, for instance, the latest kits about genetically engineering frogs, I just think is sort of morally and ethically wrong. I think that is then when we start talking about what should people be thinking about in terms of the ethics of any kind of scientific experiment. And to provide live frogs for people, in essence, just to sort of play around with and then eventually kill them. Me personally, I have a real problem with that. And I think, unfortunately, what it does, it tarnishes the image of the entire community for what I consider to be more of kind of a stunt, and a publicity stunt, more than actually trying to encourage more people to engage around science in this particular field.
So that brings up the question of self-experimentation, which Josiah has also engaged in. Do you have the same ethical concerns and moral concerns around self-experimentation, not with frogs, but with your own body?
I don't care what anyone does to their own body. I think the problem that what stunts like that do is that it then encourages more and more people to sort of do that without them necessarily understanding what the risks are that they're introducing to themselves. And I think, that is one of the issues that we, were looking at in that citizen health project I was discussing was, how can you actually enable people to enter into this type of research in a safe and responsible manner, which I would argue most people are actually doing. And there's only a handful of people that are pulling these stupid stunts, I would say, to draw attention to themselves, but it harms the larger community, unfortunately.
So there are ongoing challenges facing the DIYbio community, things such as access to materials which might not be sold to individuals that aren't affiliated with a lab, or intellectual property issues. What do you think are the biggest challenges facing the community today, and how can they be overcome?
I think the biggest challenge is money. And I think most of the labs, while they've been extremely successful in terms of starting and maintaining themselves, they're constantly struggling with finding resources, in essence, to keep the doors open and to keep the programming going. And I think what the community needs to figure out, and what I hope that more foundations start recognizing, is the great value that these spaces offer to communities, and that they'll start funding them with a lot more money. A majority of the labs that we visited so far, they're all volunteer run. There's very few that actually have any paid staff that can actually manage the everyday ins and outs of running a laboratory, which is a lot of work. And that's on top of coming up with programming and courses and classes and maintaining the equipment and maintaining the materials. And I think it's been great so far, that there's been just passionate people that are keeping these labs going. But I think the community could thrive even more so if we began to see more funding going directly into the laboratories to provide either staff or to pay for actual programming.
Where would you suggest some of that funding would come from? Do you have any ideas of organizations, foundations, or government agencies that would support such a thing?
So we've seen a few organizations in different cities. So they're more locally focused foundations. I would love to see the National Science Foundation begin to fund these spaces. I think it's a public benefit. It would be a public good. It's serving directly, in a lot of instances, underserved communities, and it should be something that public dollars should be supporting wholeheartedly.
So you mentioned your work with the Wilson Center focused a lot on public policy. Are there any policy changes that you would suggest, or do anything else that would help the community thrive?
That's an interesting question. I mean, at the moment, there really doesn't seem to be any policies or regulations that are really hampering the community from existing or moving forward. The worry, I think, that I have and that others have is that you may at some point get some knee-jerk reaction from a regulatory standpoint. If and when something were to go wrong, if there was an accident, for instance, in any of these spaces. Accidents happen. They happen in university labs, they happen in industry labs. And so I think my worry is that, if that were to happen, that you get a knee-jerk reaction from either a local government, a state government, or a federal government. And that's why I think it's been so important, the work that the community has been doing over these years, and building those relationships, say, with the FBI, building those relationships with biosafety officers and the different programs that have been established, building those relationships with their local first responders, and building those relationships with other government agencies, so people know what's actually going on and what these spaces are actually all about.
So if anyone heard our conversation and is now interested in getting involved in the DIYbio community, where would you suggest they go to get started on that journey?
I would tell them to go directly to DIYbio.org. There they can search for, wherever they live, to see if there's already a community lab in their city, in their town, or if there's a meetup group that exists near them where they can then go and meet and hang out and talk about biology and citizen science with other like-minded folks.
Todd, thanks for joining me on the podcast. I think the work you're doing is very important, and I can't wait to see what's to come from you in the future. So thanks again.
Oh, thanks so much.
Hey everyone, Ryan O'Shea again, and thanks for listening to my interview with Todd. Remember to check out the show notes and more at futuregrind.org. Make sure to subscribe, leave a review, and you can also like, comment, and share to spread the word. If you'd like to keep this podcast running, you can donate at futuregrind.org/support. Till next time, this is Future Grind.